The humid air of the Louisiana bayou clung to Elias Blackmoor's skin like a second shirt as he pulled the flatboat through the cypress knees. It was 1851, and the summer sun hung low, painting the water in strokes of molten gold that concealed the shadows lurking beneath. Elias, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, kept his eyes fixed on the narrow channel ahead. His wife, Clara, sat amidships, her dark hair pinned back but fraying at the edges from the relentless heat. She held their youngest, little Theo, close to her chest, though the boy was 5 now and squirmed against the confinement. The older children, Mira and Jonas, perched on the prow like birds, Mira with her sharp gaze locked on the passing foliage, Jonas tracing patterns in the damp wood with a stick. They were heading home to Blackmoor Plantation, a sprawling patch of land inherited from Elias's father, though plantation felt too grand for the moss-draped house and its struggling fields. The war with Mexico had taken its toll on cotton prices, and the family's fortunes ebbed like the tide. Elias glanced back at Clara, her face drawn from the journey from New Orleans. "We'll make it before dark," he said, his voice steady, the pole dipping rhythmically into the murky water. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the children. Mira, at 8, had been unnaturally quiet since they'd left the city, her small hands folded in her lap as if guarding a secret. Jonas, 10 and wiry, hummed a tuneless melody that echoed oddly over the still bayou. As the boat rounded a bend, the silhouette of the house emerged from the haze, white columns choked with Spanish moss, the gallery sagging under years of neglect. Fireflies began to wink in the gathering dusk, their lights pulsing like distant stars fallen into the swamp. Elias felt a familiar ache in his chest, not just from the labor, but from the weight of what awaited them. The overseer had sent word of poor yields, and whispers from the quarters spoke of fever in the fields. But it was the house itself that pulled at him, its windows like empty eyes staring out from the overgrowth. Clara stirred as they neared the dock, a rickety affair of weathered planks. "Children, mind your father," she murmured, though Mira and Jonas had already scrambled to help with the lines. Theo whimpered softly, his eyelids heavy, but Clara hushed him with a lullaby fragment, her voice soft against the chorus of frog calls rising from the banks. Elias tied off the boat, his calloused hands quick and sure, then lifted the first crate of supplies. The air thickened with a scent of magnolia and decay, the bayou's breath. As they trudged up the path, gravel crunching underfoot, Elias noticed how the Spanish moss seemed to sway without wind, tendrils curling like fingers toward the ground. Inside, the house was cooler, the wide halls echoing their footsteps. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light from the setting sun. Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper who'd stayed on through the lean years, met them at the door, her face lined and wary. "Welcome back, Mr. Blackmoor," she said, taking Clara's shawl. "Supper's warming." Her eyes flicked to the children, lingering a beat too long on Mira, who met her gaze without blinking. Elias clapped Jonas on the shoulder. "Show your brother the way to his room, lad." Jonas nodded, grabbing Theo's hand, but as they moved toward the stairs, Elias caught the boy glancing back, his expression unreadable in the dimness. That night, after a simple meal of cornbread and greens, the family retired early. The children's room was at the end of the upper hall, its walls papered in faded florals that peeled at the corners. Clara tucked them in, kissing each forehead, Myra's cool and still, Jonas's flushed from excitement, Theo's damp with the day's heat. "Sleep well, my darlings," she whispered, extinguishing the lantern. The room fell into shadow, save for the moonlight filtering through the gauzy curtains. Elias waited in the doorway, his frame filling the space, before following her to their own chamber. But sleep evaded him. The house creaked like an old ship, settling into the night. Sometime past midnight, a sound pulled him from his doze, a faint rustle, like pages turning in the dark. He rose, barefoot on the cool floorboards, and padded to the children's door. It was ajar as Mira always left it. Moonlight spilled across the beds, illuminating the three small forms. Theo snored softly, his face buried in the pillow. Jonas lay on his side, chest rising and falling in rhythm. Mira was on her back, arms at her sides, the quilt pulled to her chin, and her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, wide and unblinking, reflecting the pale light like polished glass. Elias's breath caught. He stepped closer, heart thudding. "Mira," he whispered, but she didn't stir. No flutter of lashes, no shift in her gaze. Just that steady, vacant watchfulness. He reached out, gently closing her lids with his fingertips. They stayed shut for a moment. Then, as if by some invisible string, her eyes snapped open again, fixed once more on the shadows above. Elias backed away, a chill seeping through the humid air. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, childish restlessness. But as he returned to bed, the rustle came again, fainter now, from beyond the door. The bayou outside hummed with unseen life, and in the house, something stirred in the quiet hours, watching. Elias Blackmoor wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air of the bayou clinging to his skin like a second shirt. The lantern in his hand flickered as he stepped carefully over the gnarled roots snaking from the cypress trees, their branches draped in Spanish moss that swayed like funeral veils in the faint breeze. It was well past midnight, and the only sounds were the distant croak of frogs and the soft lap of water against the skiff he'd tied to a stump earlier. Lydia had begged him not to go out alone, her voice tight with that familiar worry, but he'd seen the way the children stared at the ceiling that evening, their eyes unblinking even as their chests rose and fell in sleep. Something was wrong in the house they'd bought sight unseen, this crumbling plantation on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that answers lay in the dark beyond the porch. He paused at the water's edge, the lantern casting a golden pool that danced on the black surface. Rumors from the town, whispers of the previous owners vanishing into the swamp, leaving behind tales of fevered dreams and sleepless nights, had seemed like the exaggerations of superstitious folk. But now, with the children's pale faces etched in his mind, Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He untied the skiff with steady hands, the rope coarse against his calluses from years of hauling cotton bales. Pushing off, he rowed into the channel, the oars dipping silently, each stroke pulling him deeper into the labyrinth of waterways. The family had come here for a fresh start after the mill in Natchez burned down, taking their savings with it. Lydia's caution had kept them afloat, her sharp eye for ledgers turning scraps into meals, while the twins, Samuel and Eliza, brought their quiet energy to every chore. Brave as he was, Elias knew this place tested them all. The skiff glided past a cluster of willows, their roots clawing at the mud like skeletal fingers. Elias's mind wandered to the old woman in town, Mama Rue, who'd crossed herself when he mentioned the Blackmoor name. "That land's got eyes," she'd muttered, her gaze slipping away as if afraid to hold his. He'd laughed it off then, but now the words echoed. A ripple disturbed the water ahead, too deliberate for a fish. He froze, or mid-stroke, heart thudding against his ribs. The lantern swung gently, illuminating nothing but shadows that seemed to shift just beyond the light. Just an alligator, he told himself, voice low and steady, the way he did when Samuel woke from nightmares back home. But the ripple came again, closer, circling like a predator, sizing up its meal. Elias gripped the oar tighter, scanning the banks. The plantation's history was a patchwork of stories. French settlers who'd fled yellow fever, Creole traders who'd vanished with their gold, and always the mention of children, ghostly figures said to wander the halls at night, eyes wide and watchful. He shook his head, focusing on the path ahead. The plan was simple. Row to the old family plot the realtor had marked on the map, an overgrown cemetery a mile in, to see if there were clues about the land's curse or whatever folly haunted it. Lydia would be pacing the porch now, her wit turning to sharp words if he returned empty-handed. Foolhardy as ever, she'd say, but with that undercurrent of relief. The skiff bumped against something submerged, jolting him forward. Water sloshed over the side, cold and murky. Elias leaned over, peering into the depths, but saw only his reflection fractured by the lantern's glow. Then a hand, pale and small, brushed the surface, fingers trailing like weeds before sinking away. He jerked back, breath catching, the oar slipping from his grasp into the water with a splash. It bobbed for a moment, then was gone, pulled under by an unseen current. Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced it down. Brave Elias Blackmoor who'd face floods and fevers without flinching. Yet this felt different, intimate, as if the swamp itself reached for him. Paddling with one oar proved clumsy, the skiff veering wildly as he fought to regain control. The circling ripples grew bolder, converging behind him. Elias rowed harder, muscles burning, the cemetery's distant silhouette emerging through the mist, crooked stones like broken teeth against the skyline. But as he neared, a whisper cut through the night, faint and childlike, carried on the wind. "Papa, why do you leave us?" It wasn't Samuel's voice, nor Eliza's, but it twisted in his gut all the same. He beached the skiff with a grunt, scrambling onto the muddy shore, lantern raised high. The graves were choked with vines, names faded to illegible smears, but one stone stood clearer, etched with Blackmoor and dates from a century past. Beneath it, the earth seemed disturbed, as if something had clawed its way up recently. Elias knelt, brushing away the dirt, his fingers trembling despite his resolve. A small locket lay half-buried, its chain tarnished but intact. He pried it open, revealing a miniature portrait of two children, eyes staring out with unnatural clarity, just like his own twins. The whisper returned, closer now from the trees. "They never close." He snapped the locket shut, shoving it into his pocket, and backed toward the skiff. The swamp was alive, with movement, shadows darting at the edge of sight, the water churning as if boiling from below. Whatever stalked this place had marked the Blackmoors long before they arrived, and now it hunger the lantern in his hand flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cypress knees that jutted from the water like broken fingers. It was well past midnight, and the family's skiff rocked gently against the dock, its hull scarred from years of navigating the murky channels. Beside him, his wife Clara stood rigid, her shawl pulled tight despite the warmth, eyes fixed on the dark line of the treeline where their home lay hidden. "The children haven't stirred since supper," she whispered, her voice barely cutting through the chorus of frog croaks. Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Little Theo and Mira had always been light sleepers, their laughter echoing through the cabin until the fire died down. But tonight, after the fever took hold, they'd gone still as the water around them, eyes wide open, unblinking, staring at nothing. He stepped onto the warped boards of the dock, the wood groaning under his boots. Clara followed, her hand brushing his arm for reassurance. In the distance, the lantern light caught the glint of the cabin's tin roof, a faint beacon amid the Spanish moss that draped the oaks like funeral veils. Elias had built this place with his own hands after the war, swearing it would shield them from the world's cruelties. Now it felt like a trap. As they approached, a low hum rose from the swamp. Not the usual insect drone, but something deeper, like the earth itself breathing. Clara halted, clutching the small bundle of herbs she'd gathered earlier, their bitter scent a feeble ward against whatever stalked their nights. "Elias, listen," she said, her caution sharpening her words. He strained, hearing it too, a rhythmic pulse, syncing with the thud of his heart. Pushing open the cabin door, the hinges creaked like a warning. The air inside was thick, unchanged from when they'd left to fetch the midwife from town. The children's room was at the back, partitioned by a thin curtain. Elias lit the oil lamp on the table, its glow spilling across the rough-hewn floors. Clara moved first, parting the fabric with trembling fingers. Theo lay on his pallet, chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes, stared straight up at the rafters, pupils dilated like black wells. Mira mirrored him on the adjacent bed, her small hands folded neatly, as if posed for some macabre portrait. No fever flush colored their cheeks. Instead, their skin held an unnatural pallor, cool to the touch when Clara knelt and pressed her palm to Theo's forehead. "They're breathing," Elias murmured, relief warring with unease. He leaned closer to Mira, waving a hand before her gaze. No flicker, no recognition, just that vacant stare, as if she'd seen something beyond the ceiling and couldn't look away. The hum from outside grew louder, vibrating through the walls, and Elias straightened, glancing toward the window. Shadows shifted in the yard, longer than they should be in the moonlight. Clara rose, her face set with the quiet resolve that had drawn him to her years ago. The old woman in town spoke of spirits in the water, ones that steal the soul while the body rests. "We need to wake them, Elias. Salt the thresholds, burn the sage." Her words carried no hysteria, just the practical edge of someone who'd lost too much to floods and fever already. He fetched the salt from the pantry, the coarse grains spilling like tiny avalanches as he traced lines across the doorways. But as he worked, a chill seeped in, unrelated to the night air. Theo's lips parted slightly, and a soft sigh escaped, not a breath, but a wordless murmur that echoed the swamp's hum. Elias froze, salt shaker hovering. For a moment, he swore he saw movement in the boy's eyes, a subtle shift, like ripples on still water, pulling toward something unseen. Outside, the skiff bumped the dock again, though no wind stirred the moss. Clara joined him at the window, her hand finding his. "We can't leave them like this till dawn," she said, voice steady but laced with fear. Elias nodded, grabbing the rifle from above the mantel. Whatever was calling from the bayou, it had reached inside their home now. As they stood watch, the children's open eyes seemed to track the shadows creeping across the floor, silent witnesses to the night unfolding. The lantern in his hand flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cypress knees that jutted from the murky water like the fingers of drowned men. It was past midnight, and the family's old skiff rocked gently against the dock, its wood warped and slick with moss. He shouldn't have come out here alone, not after what he'd seen in the house that afternoon. The way little Annabelle's eyes had stared unblinking from her cradle, pale and fixed on the ceiling as if watching something invisible crawl across the beams. "Pa!" The voice was small, trembling from the darkness behind him. It was Thomas, his eldest boy, no more than 10, clutching the edge of the dock with white-knuckled hands. Elias turned, his heart thudding. The child had followed him, silent as a ghost, his nightshirt damp and clinging. "Go back inside, Tom," Elias whispered, keeping his voice low. The swamp was alive with sounds tonight. The croak of bullfrogs, the distant splash of an alligator sliding into the water, and something else, a low hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "This ain't no place for you." Thomas didn't move. His eyes, wide and shadowed, darted to the water. "I heard it again. The singing, like Mama used to do, but wrong." Elias felt a chill despite the heat. His wife, Clara, had hummed those old Creole lullabies before the fever took her last winter, back in New Orleans. They'd come to this crumbling plantation hoping for a fresh start, away from the city's yellow fever and the debts that hounded them. But the Blackmoor estate, inherited from some distant uncle, felt more like a grave than a home. The children had changed since arriving, sleeping fitfully, their eyes snapping open at odd hours, unseeing yet aware. "Ain't nothing but the wind," Elias lied, stepping closer to pull the boy back. But as he did, a ripple spread across the water, slow and deliberate, heading toward the dock. The lantern light caught it. Not a fish, not an alligator, but a shape, pale, elongated, like a child's arm breaking the surface. Thomas gasped, pointing. "Look." Elias froze. The water parted, and there it was, a small hand, white as bone, fingers splayed, reaching up from the depths. It grasped at the air, then sank back with a soft glug. The hum grew louder, weaving through the reeds, words forming in the mist, faint, garbled, like a child's plea twisted by the current. "Pa, it's Annabelle," Thomas whimpered, tears streaking his face. "She's calling us." Elias yanked the boy away, his boots slipping on the wet planks. No, it couldn't be. Annabelle was inside, bundled in her room, her tiny chest rising and falling in what passed for sleep. But the family stories whispered of the bayou's curse. The old ones said children who drowned here never truly left, their eyes open forever, watching from the water for kin to join them. He dragged Thomas toward the path leading back to the house, the lanterns swinging wildly. Branches snagged at their clothes, thorns drawing blood that they didn't feel in the panic. Behind them, the ripples multiplied, a chorus of splashes echoing like laughter. The house loomed ahead, its sagging porch lit by a single candle in the window. Elias burst through the door, slamming it shut, his breath ragged. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something sweeter, like overripe fruit. The younger children, Mary and little James, sat at the kitchen table, their eyes open wide, unmoving. They didn't turn at the noise. "Annabelle." Elias called, his voice cracking. No answer. He set the lantern down and climbed the creaking stairs, Thomas trailing like a shadow. In the nursery, the cradle was empty. The blanket lay rumpled, as if she'd simply slipped out. Elias's stomach twisted. The window was ajar, curtains billowing in the faint breeze. He leaned out, staring into the night, and there, below, in the yard, a small figure toddled toward the dock, her nightgown trailing like a specter. God, no, he muttered, bolting down the stairs. Thomas screamed after him, but Elias was already out the door, feet pounding the dirt path. The bayou's hum swelled, pulling at him, promising secrets in its depths. He reached her just as her tiny feet touched the dock's edge. Annabelle. He scooped her up, her body limp and cold in his arms, eyes wide open, staring past him into the water. She didn't cry, didn't struggle, just gazed, unblinking, at the ripples that now lapped hungrily at the wood. Carrying her back, Elias felt the weight of the night settle deeper. The children inside would need watching now, every moment, lest the bayou claim them one by one. But as he crossed the threshold, Annabelle's lips moved, whispering a tune Clara once sang, her voice not her own. The house groaned in response, as if the walls themselves were listening. Elias Blackmoor wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air clinging to his skin like a second layer of fever. The lantern's flame flickered weakly against the cypress knees rising from the murky water, casting shadows that danced like specters on the boat's splintered sides. Beside him, his wife Clara gripped the oar, her knuckles white, her breaths coming in shallow bursts. The children, little Theo and Mira, huddled at the bow, their eyes wide and unblinking in the dim light, just as they had been since the night the whispers began in the old plantation house. "We can't keep drifting like this," Clara murmured, her voice barely cutting through the chorus of cicadas and distant frog calls. The bayou had swallowed the path home hours ago, the water rising with the storm that refused to break. Elias nodded, scanning the twisted branches overhead. The external threat wasn't just the flood. It was the thing that followed them, the shadow that slithered just beyond the light, a presence drawn by the children's unnatural vigil. Theo shifted, his small hand clutching Myra's dress. "Papa, it's watching," he said, his words flat, as if recited from a dream. Elias's heart clenched. The boy hadn't closed his eyes in days, not since the fever took hold and left them staring, pupils dilated like black moons. Mira nodded in eerie agreement, her gaze fixed on the water's surface, where ripples spread without wind. "Quiet now," Elias whispered, though he felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes. He rowed harder, muscles burning, the boat scraping against submerged roots. Clara pointed ahead, her finger trembling. There, solid ground. A narrow spit of earth emerged from the mist, overgrown with Spanish moss that hung like funeral veils. They beached the skiff with a jolt, vines snagging at their legs as they pulled the children ashore. The island, if it could be called that, was little more than a tangle of mud and mangroves, but it offered respite. Elias tethered the boat, his calloused hands shaking as he knotted the rope. Clara gathered dry twigs, her movements precise despite the exhaustion etching lines around her eyes. She was the cautious one, always planning 2 steps ahead, but tonight her caution frayed at the edges. "We light no fire," she said firmly. "It'll draw them." "Them?" Elias echoed, though he knew. The rival trappers from upriver, the ones who'd whispered of curses in the taverns, claiming the Blackmoor's land after the yellow fever swept through. But it was more than men. The children's open-eyed sleep had started the rumors, turning neighbors into hunters. Elias had seen the glint of rifles in the underbrush earlier, before the waters rose and scattered everyone. As the children sat motionless on a fallen log, their eyelids heavy but refusing to drop, Elias knelt before them. Theo's face was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight filtering through the canopy, a single bead of sweat tracing his temple. "Tell me what you see," Elias urged softly, his brave facade cracking. He was the storyteller of the family, weaving tales to ease their fears, but words failed him now. Mira tilted her head, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo from the trees. "Eyes in the water. They wait for us to sleep." Theo echoed her, their words overlapping in chilling unison. Clara froze mid-motion, a twig snapping in her grasp. The air thickened, the cicadas falling silent, as if holding breath. Elias stood abruptly, peering into the dark. A splash, distant but deliberate, rippled across the bayou. He grabbed the rifle from the boat, its barrel cold against his palm. "Stay with them," he told Clara, stepping toward the water's edge. The mud sucked at his boots, each step a pull toward the depths. In the lantern's glow, he glimpsed it, not a trapper's boat, but something smoother, gliding beneath the surface like an alligator's shadow, larger than any beast he'd hunted. Clara's hand found his arm, pulling him back. "Elias, don't. We face this together." Her eyes, sharp with wit even in terror, met his. She wasn't one for blind courage. She'd always argued for cunning over force. "The children, they're the key. If we can make them close their eyes." But the splash came again, closer, the water churning. Theo and Mira rose as one, pointing into the gloom. "It's coming," they said, their open eyes reflecting the moon's cold light. Elias raised the rifle, heart pounding, as the first tendrils of fog curled around their ankles, carrying the faint, rotten scent of the deep bayou. The night pressed in, the family's fragile sanctuary shrinking with every unseen ripple. Elias Blackmoor wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air of the bayou clinging to his skin like a second layer of regret. The lantern in his hand flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cypress knees that rose from the murky water like the knuckles of drowned giants. It was well past midnight, and the only sounds were the distant croak of frogs and the soft lap of water against the pirogue's hull. Beside him, his wife Clara sat rigid, her fingers twisting the hem of her faded apron, while their eldest son, Thomas, pulled them deeper into the swamp. The boy, 17 now, with eyes too old for his years, had insisted on this fool's errand, claiming the whispers from the children's room had grown too loud to ignore. "Pa, you feel it too," Thomas murmured, his voice barely rising above the night's hush. He didn't look back, his shoulders set in that stubborn line Elias knew all too well. "Them eyes, they ain't just sleepin'. Something's watchin' through 'em." Elias grunted, shifting the weight of the shotgun across his lap. He wanted to argue, to call it fever dreams from the yellow heat that plagued the plantation every summer, but the memory of little Mary's gaze that morning stopped him cold. Open, unblinking, fixed on the ceiling as if tracing invisible threads. And then there were the twins, asleep in their crib with lids parted just enough to gleam in the candlelight, like polished river stones. The doctor from town had shaken his head, muttering about miasma and bad air, but Elias knew better. This land had secrets, buried deep in the roots of the old oaks, secrets the Blackmoors had stirred when they claimed this patch of Louisiana soil a generation back. Clara's hand found his knee, squeezing hard enough to bruise. "We shouldn't have left them alone," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry Spanish moss. "What if? They're safe with the maid, Elias cut in, sharper than he meant. But doubt gnawed at him, the same doubt that had driven them out here, following Thomas's half-remembered tales from the slaves who spoke of spirits in the water, eyes that never closed because they hungered for the living. The boy had overheard them one night, gathering by the quarters, their chants low and rhythmic under the moon. Now, poling through the black water, Elias wondered if ignorance had been a mercy. A ripple disturbed the surface ahead, not the lazy swirl of an alligator, but something sharper, like fingers trailing just beneath. Thomas froze, the pole hovering midair. "There," he said, pointing to a cluster of willows where the branches hung heavy, dripping with veils of moss that swayed without wind. In the lantern's glow, Elias glimpsed it, a shape, pale and elongated, slipping between the roots. Not animal, not quite human. His heart thudded, the shotgun suddenly heavy as sin. "Turn us around," Clara pleaded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But Thomas shook his head, eyes locked on the willows.
"No, Ma.
"We gotta see. For the little ones." Elias raised the gun, the barrel steady despite the tremor in his gut. The air thickened, carrying a faint, briny scent like tears from the sea. From the shadows, a child's laughter echoed, soft, playful, but wrong, as if bubbled up through mud. Mary's voice, or one like it. And in that moment, Elias understood. Whatever watched through their children's eyes had been waiting for them to come looking. The pirogue drifted closer, the water parting like reluctant lips, and the eyes emerged first, dozens of them, lidless and luminous, peering from the depths. Elias Blackmoor wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air of the bayou clinging to his skin like a second layer of sin. The lantern's flame flickered weakly against the encroaching dusk, casting long shadows that danced across the twisted cypress roots. He had ventured deeper into the swamp than he'd intended, driven by whispers from the children, those pale, unblinking eyes that followed him even in sleep. "Papa, the water sings," little Mira had murmured that morning, her lids half parted, revealing the glassy stare that chilled him more than the fever. Now, alone with the chorus of insects and the distant croak of frogs, Elias wondered if the madness had taken root in him too. The skiff rocked gently as he pulled through the murky water, his calloused hands gripping the pole like a lifeline. He'd come searching for Old Man Thibodeau, the Creole trapper who claimed knowledge of the old rites, the ones that could bind spirits back to the earth. Thibodeau's shack was said to be hidden among the willows, marked by a lantern that burned blue at night. But the bayou played tricks, paths that seemed straight twisted into labyrinths, and Elias had already doubled back twice, his boots soaked through with the fetid sludge. A rustle in the underbrush snapped his head around. His heart pounded, a dull thud against his ribs. "Who's there?" he called, voice rough from disuse. Only silence answered, broken by the plop of something heavy slipping into the water. "Gator," he told himself, forcing his grip to steady. But the children's words echoed. They watch from the roots, Papa. They wait for the blood moon. The family had arrived in Louisiana scant months ago, fleeing the gray factories of Manchester for promises of fertile land. Instead, they'd found this, a plantation crumbling under vines, and children who no longer closed their eyes at night. Pushing on, Elias spotted a faint glow ahead, not blue, but a sickly yellow that pulsed like a heartbeat. He beached the skiff on a knot of roots and stepped onto the spongy ground, mud sucking at his boots. The shack emerged from the mist, its walls patched with moss and driftwood, door ajar like an invitation. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and decay. Thibodeau sat hunched over a table, his back to the door, muttering in a patois Elias couldn't parse. Bottles of murky liquid lined the shelves, and in the corner, a crude altar bore feathers, bones, and a mirror cracked down the center. Thibodeau, Elias said, stepping forward. The old man didn't turn, his shoulders shaking with what might have been laughter or sobs. I've come about my young ones. They sleep with eyes wide, like the dead ain't restin' proper. Still no response. Elias moved closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. That's when he saw it. On the table, a doll fashioned from corn husks and twine, its eyes sewn open with black thread. Beside it lay a locket, Elias's locket, the one with his wife's miniature portrait, vanished from the mantel days ago. His breath caught. How? The children must have taken it, in their trance-like wanderings, offerings to whatever haunted this place. Thibodeau finally stirred, his voice a rasp like dry leaves. "De eyes, mon ami. Dey see what you blind to. De loa, dey hungry since de flood. You bring de old blood here, from across de water?" Elias swallowed, the implications twisting in his gut. His ancestors, whispers of which trials in England, buried deep. "What do you mean?" "I just want to fix 'em, make 'em sleep right." The trapper turned then, his face a map of scars, eyes milky but sharp. "Ain't no fixin'. De children, dey vessels now. You want peace? Give what dey ask." He gestured to the doll, then to a bowl of dark liquid that steamed without fire. "Drink dis. See true." Elias hesitated, the lantern's light catching the steam's curl, forming shapes that looked too much like small faces. Outside, the bayou whispered, branches scratching the walls like nails on wood. He thought of Clara, his eldest, who had started humming tunes no one knew, melodies that curdled the milk. If this was madness, better to embrace it than watch his family unravel thread by thread. With trembling hands, he lifted the bowl. The liquid tasted of earth and copper, burning down his throat. Vision blurred, then sharpened, impossibly. The shack shadows deepened, peeling back to reveal figures, translucent children, not his, but echoes of the plantation's past, their eyes open wide, beckoning. Elias gasped, dropping the bowl. It shattered, spilling across the floor in rivulets that snaked toward Thibodeau's feet. The old man smiled, teeth yellowed. "Now you see. But seein' ain't enough. Dey want you to join." Elias backed toward the door, pulse roaring in his ears. The doll's eyes seemed to follow him, unblinking. He fled into the night, the skiff waiting like a faithful dog, but as he pulled away, the glow behind him shifted, blue now, pulsing in rhythm with the distant chant rising from the water. The children would be waiting at home, eyes open, and this time he'd have no lies to tell them. The truth was rising, sticky as the mud, and it would claim them all before dawn. Elias Blackmoor gripped the lantern's handles so tightly his knuckles ached, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat against the humid night. The bayou's edge pressed close, its waters murmuring secrets through the cypress knees that twisted up from the muck like skeletal fingers. He'd come out here alone, leaving the house's creaking silence behind, because the children's whispers had grown too loud, echoing in his skull even after he'd bolted their bedroom door. Open eyes in the dark, staring at nothing and everything, pulling him toward this forsaken spot where the old midwife's tale said the veil thinned. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay, Spanish moss draping the branches overhead like funeral veils. Elias stepped carefully over a root, his boots sinking into the soft earth, each footfall a reluctant surrender to the pull he couldn't name. He wasn't a superstitious man, had built his cotton fields on sweat and iron will, but the dreams had worn him down. Dreams of his son, little Theo, standing at the water's edge with eyes wide and unblinking, beckoning shapes from the depths. Last night, Elias had woken to find Theo's bed empty, only to discover the boy curled in the corner, murmuring words in a tongue that twisted like smoke. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the chorus of frogs. Nothing answered but the lap of water against the bank. He pressed on, the lantern casting long shadows that danced like specters. The midwife's cabin ruins lay ahead, half sunken into the swamp, its walls sagging under vines thick as ropes. This was where it started, or so the whispers claimed, the night the fever took the first child, and the eyes stayed open as if guarding some unholy watch. Elias knelt by the crumbling steps, setting the lantern down. His hands trembled as he pulled the small bundle from his coat, a lock of Theo's hair, tied with a ribbon from his daughter's dress. The servant woman, Mira, had warned him against this, said meddling with the old ways would only feed the hunger. But what choice did he have? The children weren't eating, their skin paling to the color of moonlight, and last evening, young Clara had traced symbols on the window pane with her fingertip, symbols that glowed faintly before fading like dying embers. He whispered the incantation Mira had reluctantly shared, words that tasted of ash on his tongue. The water stilled, unnaturally so, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Then, ripples spread from the center of the bayou, slow and deliberate, as if something massive stirred below. Elias's heart pounded. A shape broke the surface, not a fish, not an alligator, but a face, pale and childlike, eyes wide open, staring right through him. It wasn't Theo or Clara. It was smaller, older, the features blurred by the water's sheen, but the gaze pinned him, unblinking, pulling at the edges of his sanity. He scrambled back, the bundle slipping from his fingers into the mud. The face sank without a splash, but the ripples carried a whisper now, faint and insistent. "They see us. Let them see." Elias snatched up the lantern and ran, branches whipping his face, the ground sucking at his boots. Behind him, the bayou exhaled a low groan, as if the swamp itself were waking. By the time he burst through the manor's back door, sweat-soaked and gasping, the house felt alive with anticipation. Mira waited in the kitchen, her dark eyes sharp in the firelight. "Did it answer?" she asked, voice steady but laced with fear. Elias collapsed into a chair, the lantern clattering on the table. "Worse," he muttered. "It knows we're trying to end it." Upstairs, a child's laughter echoed. Light, playful, but wrong, like glass shattering in slow motion. The door to their room rattled faintly, though no wind stirred the curtains. Elias exchanged a glance with Mira. They both knew the ritual had stirred something deeper, and now the children weren't just watching. They were waiting. Elias Blackmoor gripped the lantern's handle until his knuckles ached, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat against the humid night. The bayou's edge pressed in close, cypress knees rising from the water like skeletal fingers, and the air hung thick with the scent of decay and distant rain. His daughter, Lila, clung to his side, her small hand slick with sweat in his. She hadn't spoken since they'd fled the cabin, her eyes wide but unblinking, mirroring the unnatural stare of her brother, Tom, who trudged ahead with Margaret. The boy's steps were too steady, too mechanical, as if the fever that had gripped him days ago had hollowed him out and filled the space with something else. "Keep moving," Elias whispered, his voice rough from shouting earlier. The rival trappers, those rough men from the upstream camps, had circled too close that afternoon, their dogs baying at the scent of the Blackmoor's hidden cache of pelts. But it wasn't just the theft they feared now, it was the whispers that followed, tales of the old Creole curse that turned children's eyes to mirrors of the dead. Elias had dismissed them as swamp superstition until Tom's gaze locked open in sleep, unyielding even to pricked fingers or cold cloths. Margaret glanced back, her face gaunt in the lantern's glow, dark circles bruising her cheeks. She adjusted the sling holding their dwindling supplies, dried jerky, a flask of water, the silver locket that had been her mother's. "The skiff's just beyond these willows," she said, her tone clipped, forcing calm. But her free hand trembled as she reached for Tom's shoulder. He didn't flinch, didn't turn, just kept walking, his bare feet silent on the mud. A low growl rippled from the underbrush, not from any dog, but something deeper, like the bayou itself stirring. Lila whimpered, burying her face in Elias's coat. He scanned the shadows, heart pounding. The trappers had mentioned a shortage of game this season, driving them desperate, but this felt wrong, predatory in a way that chilled beyond the night's damp. Earlier, their first attempt to slip away had backfired when Tom wandered toward the men's campfire, his open eyes reflecting the flames like polished glass, drawing shouts and rifles raised in panic. They'd barely escaped, the boys' eerie silence marking them as marked folk. Tom stopped abruptly at the water's edge, the skiff bobbing gently against its mooring. Moonlight silvered the ripples, but Elias's gaze caught on his son's face, those eyes, fixed on nothing yet seeing everything, pupils dilated like black voids. "Tom," Margaret urged, kneeling beside him. "We need to go. Now." She tugged his arm, but he resisted, his small body rigid. From the darkness upstream, a splash echoed, followed by the creak of oars. The trappers were closing in, their lanterns piercing the fog like accusing eyes. Elias shoved the lantern into the skiff and lifted Lila aboard, her body light as a bird's against the wood. "Push off," he told Margaret, who was already guiding Tom inside. But as Elias untied the rope, a hand, cold, insistent, brushed his ankle from the water. He jerked back, splashing into the shallows, the lantern tumbling to douse in the murk. Darkness swallowed them whole. In the sudden black, Lila's voice pierced the air, small but fierce. "Papa, it's coming." Not the trappers, but whatever lurked beneath, drawn by the curse's pull. Tom finally moved, his open eyes turning toward the sound, and for the first time, a faint smile ghosted his lips, not his, but borrowed from the bayou's hungry depths. Margaret fumbled for the oars, her breaths coming in gasps. "Row, Elias. Row like the devils behind us." He hauled himself in, water streaming from his clothes, and seized the wood, pulling hard against the current. The skiff lurched forward, but the splashes multiplied, circling like wolves. Tom sat unmoving, his gaze locked on the pursuing lights, and Elias wondered if they were fleeing men or the thing that had already claimed their son. As the bayou narrowed into twisting channels, the first real cost hit. Lila's hand slipped from his in the chaos, and when he reached for her, she was staring too, eyes open, unblinking, joining her brother in silent watch. Margaret's sob broke the rhythm of the oars, but Elias didn't stop. The curse had taken root, spreading like fever through the blood, and the trapper's pursuit was just the shadow of a larger hunger. They pressed on, the skiff cutting through the night, but the eyes in the darkness followed, patient and eternal. Elias Blackmoor gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering like a dying heartbeat against the humid night. The bayou's edge pressed in, cypress knees rising from the muck like skeletal fingers, and the air hung thick with the croak of frogs and something deeper, a low, unnatural hum that seemed to pulse from the water itself. He glanced back at the cabin, its windows dark now, the children's forms still as stones inside. Open eyes, staring at nothing, just as they'd been since the fever took hold. Or whatever it was. Not fever. Something older. Keep moving, he muttered to himself, boots sinking into the soft earth as he pushed toward the old priest's shack. Father Duval had come from New Orleans years ago, whispering of spirits in the swamp, of eyes that watched without blinking. Elias had laughed then, a tobacco farmer with calloused hands and a wife's grave fresh dug. But now, with the children like that, Lila and Tom, their lids unmoving, breaths shallow but steady, he'd trek through the night if it meant answers. The path narrowed, vines snagging at his trousers like insistent hands. A splash echoed from the left, too deliberate for an alligator. He froze, heart thudding. The hum grew louder, vibrating in his chest, pulling him toward the water.
No.
Focus. The priest's light was ahead, a faint glow through the Spanish moss. As he neared, the door creaked open before he knocked. Duval stood there, gaunt and shadowed, his eyes, God, his eyes, wide and unblinking, just like the children's. Blackmoor, the old man rasped, voice like dry leaves. You feel it too, the gaze. Elias stepped inside, the air inside cooler, laced with incense and decay. Shelves lined the walls, jars of murky liquid catching the lantern light, things floating within that he didn't want to name. My young uns, he said, words tumbling out. They ain't right. Sleepin' but watchin'. Like they're seein' something we can't. Duval nodded slowly, turning to a scarred table where an ancient book lay open, pages yellowed and curling. The bayou remembers. Before the French, before the chains. The eyes of the drowned. They call to the blood. He traced a finger over faded script, symbols twisting like roots. Your wife, she walked these waters last, didn't she? Singin' those old songs. Elias swallowed, the memory sharp, Mary's voice lilting over the levee, then silence one stormy dawn. Found her floating, eyes open, staring at the sky. What do I do? He demanded, voice cracking. The priest's hand shot out, gripping Elias's wrist. Cold, too cold. You listen. Close your eyes and let it in. Fight and it takes more. Outside, the hum swelled, and Elias felt it, a pressure behind his lids, urging them apart. He yanked free, stumbling back. The jars rattled on their shelves, the things inside swirling faster. Duval smiled, lids never fluttering. It's already in you, brother. Join the watch. Elias bolted for the door, lanterns swinging wild, casting shadows that stretched like reaching arms. The night closed around him, the children's faces flashing in his mind, open, endless. He ran, but the path twisted, leading him deeper into the swamp, where the water lapped hungry at the banks. And in the dark, he swore he saw eyes reflecting back from the depths, waiting for him to stop running. Elias gripped the lantern's handle until his knuckles blanched, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat too quick to trust. The attic air hung thick, laced with the scent of old wood and something sharper. Decay, perhaps, or the metallic tang of fierce sweat from the night before. Below, the house groaned under the weight of unspoken secrets, but up here, in the slanted shadows where the Blackmoor children's eyes had last stared unblinking, the silence pressed like a hand over his mouth. He'd come alone this time, leaving Amelia and the others in the parlor, their faces drawn tight with arguments that circled but never landed. "It's the fever," she'd insisted earlier, her voice a threadbare whisper, but Elias knew better. The children's open eyes weren't delirium's gift. They were a warning, etched into the family like the bayou's roots twisting through the soil. Now, as he scanned the dust-shrouded trunks and cobwebbed beams, he felt it again, that pull, as if the attic itself breathed, watching. The floorboard creaked under his boot, not from his weight, but from something shifting in the far corner. Elias froze, the lantern swinging gently, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters. He remembered the stories his grandmother told, of spirits bound to the land by unfinished grief, their eyes forever open to guard the living from worse. But this was no ghost tale. The Blackmoors had buried their young too hastily under a moon that hid its face, and now the consequence clawed at the edges of reality. A soft rustle, like fabric brushing against itself, emanated from behind the largest trunk. Elias's heart hammered, but he didn't call out. Instead, he edged forward, the lantern held high, its light piercing the gloom to reveal a small, pale hand curling around the trunk's edge, impossibly small, like one of the children's, but the skin was mottled, veins dark as ink beneath. "Show yourself," he murmured, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. The hand withdrew, and in its place, a pair of eyes gleamed, open, unblinking, fixed on him with a hunger that chilled deeper than the Louisiana night. Downstairs, Amelia paced the hallway, her fingers twisting the locket that held a lock of her daughter's hair. The doctor's visit had yielded nothing but shrugs and tonics, but she couldn't shake the image from the children's room, those eyes, vacant yet seeing everything. Elias had been gone too long. The attic stairs had swallowed his footsteps an eternity ago. She glanced at the grandfather clock, its tick a relentless accusation, and wondered if the family sins, the unspoken cruelties, the lands taken by force, had finally summoned what couldn't be buried. A thud echoed from above, muffled but unmistakable. Amelia's breath caught, and she bolted for the stairs, skirts tangling around her ankles. The house seemed to lean in, walls whispering as she climbed, each step amplifying the dread coiling in her gut. By the time she reached the attic door, sweat beaded her brow, and the air felt charged, like the moments before a storm breaks over the swamps. Pushing the door open, she found Elias on his knees, the lantern tipped on its side, spilling oil that smoked and hissed. He was staring at the trunk, face ashen, and in the dim light, she saw it too. The trunk's lid ajar, spilling faded linens and a doll with glass eyes that mirrored the children's, open, accusing. "Elias," she whispered, kneeling beside him, her hand on his shoulder trembling. He didn't respond at first, his gaze locked on the doll, but then he turned, eyes wide with a realization that bound them both. The Blackmoor's legacy wasn't in the fields or the fortune. It was here, in the unclosed eyes that demanded truth. As the first hints of dawn filtered through the grimy window, casting a pallid glow over the attic's chaos, Elias finally spoke. "We can't hide it anymore. The eyes, they're ours to close, or they'll take us all." Amelia nodded, the weight of it settling like mud after a flood, irrevocable, but shared. Together, they rose, the doll clutched in her hand, and descended into the waking house, where the family's reckoning awaited under the open sky. In the dim flicker of the lantern's last oil, Elias Blackmoor knelt beside the open grave, the Louisiana earth still damp from the midnight rain. The air hung heavy with the scent of magnolia and decay, the kind that clung to your skin like a fever dream. His hands, calloused from years of tilling the bayou's unforgiving soil, trembled as he brushed away the final layer of mud from the child's small coffin. Not his child, not anymore. The family had buried little Theo 2 nights past, but the whispers in the old house wouldn't cease, pulling Elias back here under the cover of stars that watched like unblinking eyes. He pried the lid with a rusted crowbar, the wood groaning in protest, splintering like brittle bone. Inside, Theo lay as they had left him, face pale and serene, dressed in the white nightshirt stained faintly at the collar. But his eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, stared up at the canopy of cypress branches overhead. Open, unseeing, yet somehow knowing. Elias's breath caught, a sharp rasp in the humid night. "Boy," he murmured, voice cracking like dry leaves, "what hold does this place have on you?" The wind stirred the moss-draped limbs, carrying a faint, rhythmic thump from the depths of the swamp. Not the heartbeat of gators or the croak of frogs, but something older, insistent, like knuckles rapping on a hollow door. Elias had ignored the family's old tales, the Blackmoor's curse, born in the fevered summers when their ancestors fled the old world, carrying secrets in their blood. Secrets that made the children sleep with eyes ajar, dreaming of things that crawled from the water. His wife, Clara, had scoffed at it all, her cautious nature turning to denial as Theo grew listless, his gaze drifting to shadows that weren't there. Their daughter, young Mira, only 8 and sharp-tongued as a whippoorwill, had begged them to listen. "He sees them, Pa. The ones in the black water." Now, alone in the graveyard's edge, Elias felt the weight of her words. He reached down, intending to close those eyes forever, but as his fingers hovered, Theo's chest rose, once shallow, like a sigh from the grave. Elias recoiled, stumbling back into the mud, heart pounding against his ribs. The lantern sputtered, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters across the headstone. "Lord, no," he whispered, scrambling to his feet. The thump grew louder, closer, vibrating through the ground like the pulse of the bayou itself. From the tree-lean, shapes emerged slow, deliberate. Not men, not beasts, but forms woven from mist and root, their eyes gleaming with the same vacant stare as Theo's. The curse's children, the ones who'd slumbered uneasily for generations, drawn by the disturbance. Elias bolted toward the path leading home, branches whipping his face, tearing at his shirt. Behind him, the grave's lid slammed shut with unnatural force, and a child's laughter echoed, light and chilling, carried on the wind. He burst into the cabin, barring the door with the heavy oak beam, his chest heaving. Clara stirred from her chair by the fire, her face etched with the lines of sleepless worry. "Elias? What madness brings you out in this storm?" Mira peeked from her room, eyes wide but not with fear, with a quiet knowing that twisted Elias's gut. "They come," he gasped, sliding down the wall, the lantern's flame dying to a glow. "Theo, he's not restin', and neither are the others." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, but Mira stepped forward, her small frame steady, voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I told you, Ma. We can't bury what's already awake." Outside, the thump resolved into footsteps, many, soft and inexorable, circling the cabin. The windows rattled, and in the glass's reflection, Elias saw them. Pale faces pressed close, eyes open, watching. Dawn broke gray and reluctant, the swamp retreating like a held breath. The forms faded with the mist, but the Blackmoors knew better than to hope. Theo's empty grave mocked them from the hill, and in their beds that night, Myra's eyes remained half-lidded, dreaming of depths where the family lines stretched eternal, unburied and unresting. Elias clutched his rifle. Clara whispered prayers to saints who'd long forgotten Louisiana, and the children, those who slept with open eyes, waited for the next pull from the black water.